attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Good evening, everyone. This is Andy Steele. Thanks again for tuning in. And tonight we are on our 99th episode of this show. That means that next week we are going to be doing our 100th episode. And why am I making such a big deal out of this, other than the fact that reaching 100 is pretty exciting? I think there's something psychological in the human mind that likes attaining a new digit in our own human-created counting system. So part of it's just kind of sentimental, but it just goes to show you that we are not giving up. We are going to keep on pushing, keep on beating the drum for this all-important cause, this cause that is still relevant here over a decade after the event took place. And I'm talking about the controlled demolition evidence. I'm talking about the fact that two planes cannot knock down 3 buildings, that the smaller top part of a building cannot crush the lower part without slowing down. I'm talking about scientific facts that the media and your government want you to forget about. Okay, folks, 2 plus 2 does not equal 5, and we are reminding you of that every week. And I know this audience knows that, but there are so many more people that need to be woken up, and it is happening in fits and spurts. But we got to keep pushing because the post-9/11 world marches on, and we can see it. And I always ask on this show, often ask on this show of guests, what happens if we don't expose this? What happens if the world doesn't acknowledge what happened to the buildings in New York on 9/11? What becomes of the world? And I think we're actually seeing that played out. And we always expect that we're going to wake up one morning and that things are going to be different. And you hear the sense in different alternative news sources talking about this day when the stuff is going to hit the fan. As if you're going to wake up one morning like the Dawn of the Dead remake, where the woman spends a weekend with her husband in the bedroom, and then she gets up in the morning and there's zombies walking around and fire off in the distance, and something horrible has happened while she was tuned out from the world. I think some of us expect something like that to take place. The stuff is going to hit the fan, whatever form that comes in your mind, but the stuff has been hitting the fan for a decade now. All right, and it's been happening even before 9/11, but it went into acceleration after 9/11. All right, its own sort of free fall acceleration of world events. The loss of civil liberties, the constant warmongering, and this is why we keep doing this, why we keep bringing it back to the science, because with everything else, people can accuse you of having a political agenda, can accuse you of trying to get inside people's heads, but which you can never really fully account for, even though you can use your own common sense and educated hypothesis on what somebody means when they say a particular thing or what their motivations are when they do certain actions. That excuse can always be thrown up at you. Oh, you're just trying to presume what somebody is thinking. But with the science, you really can't argue with it. I'm not saying they don't try to, but certain facts don't go away, and certain common sense realities are stuck in our brains. And even though we try to deny them, some of us do, because it doesn't support what we want to believe about the world, what we want to believe about 9/11 and what happened to the buildings in New York, it still resides because it's truth. And truth doesn't just go away because you call somebody a name or because you have a vast amount of money to use the media against the people that talk about the truth. So that's why ultimately we're going to win in the end, no matter how long it takes. So I'm going to be talking about a number of things today on the show. Again, I don't have a guest. That's because of a scheduling snafu. My fault, not the guest. But next week, when you tune into the show, I'm going to have a retired New York City firefighter on who was there. He was at Ground Zero. He says he saw the melted metal, steel. He saw he was there when Building 7 went down, and he agrees with us, so he'll be talking about that next week, so stay tuned for that. That'll be our 100th episode. I'm kind of treating today's episode like it's the 100th because of the way the scheduling worked out, and it gives me a chance to reflect on the 2 years that have passed since we started the show, and I don't know whether or not that should be considered a success or a failure. And I don't want to use the word failure because we are making gains. We're striding towards justice every day, every time we do something, every time we reach out and speak out, every time somebody calls into C-SPAN's Washington Journal and brings up Building 7, every time we have an anniversary and AE 9/11 Truth comes up with some great idea like they did with the billboard this year, we are making gains. And I think we're doing pretty good for a group of people who have never really had to deal with a situation like this before. Not even just individually, but I mean collectively as Americans. Now, people will argue that there's been events, that there's always been false flags that have happened throughout history, but this is the first time that the evidence has been so clear. And I've used this analogy before. It's almost like walking into a room, turning on the light, and finding your spouse in bed with your best friend. Now, what do you do with that? All right, and even you can even take the momentary shock of you discovering them and seeing that they know that you've found them away from it too. Let's just say you see it from a distance. You're watching them from afar. Now you have this information. What do you do with it? Do you deny it? Do you lie to yourself? Or do you take appropriate action? Whatever that is in that situation. And a lot of people are taking the appropriate action, but a lot of us are figuring it out as we go along because there's no real rule book for a situation like this. How do you expose it? How do you use the resources available to you to wake up as many people as possible? What do you do when the media is controlled and the government is obviously failing its people? All right, all the resources that we've been told are available to us to confront something like this have been cut off from us. So I think the people are doing pretty darn good. And the people compare this a lot of times to the situation with JFK. And I'm not going to get into the details of the JFK assassination because that's not what this show is about. But I hear people tell me, oh, it'll be just like JFK and you'll never get any justice on this. And the people will die who were involved and you'll know, it'll just be just like that event. All right, and maybe in a year, 100 years from now, people might acknowledge something. Big difference between now and back then, folks. Okay, back after JFK, we hadn't had the Vietnam War. It was in progress, but it hadn't reached its horrible conclusion. Okay, we didn't have Iran-Contra in our history. We didn't have Watergate in our history. All right, we didn't have the war of terror. We didn't have all of the lies and deception coming out on such a large scale as we've had in the decades that followed JFK, the assassination of President Kennedy. And when the President Kennedy was assassinated, we didn't have the precedent of the JFK assassination either, where people were questioning and different evidence had come out and people had an alternative view of that already in their minds before looking at other new world events. So it's a completely different situation. As well, we didn't have the internet. All right, you didn't have the ability of people to communicate on such a vast and large scale as we do now. You didn't have people able to share video. You didn't have people able to create shows like this one without the cooperation of the major media of the time. All right, you didn't have the guerrilla fighters of information like you do now. So it's a completely different situation, so there's no reason to be hopeless, and I don't like hopelessness. I don't like weakness, and I don't consider weakness having anything to do with your physical ability or your ability to jump in somebody's face if they cut you off in traffic or whatever, or intimidate somebody. I consider strength and your ability to have resolve and stand against something just like what we're facing against. All right, to be able to withstand the mass peer pressure, to not conform when the situation is so dire, when you know the house is on fire, when you know that conforming is only going to lead to a slow death for your civilization, for your country. All right, that is real strength, and the people of today, the people who've taken up this fight, are demonstrating that. So I'm going to go over a few things this week that I believe are very relevant to the topic that we've launched here. Now, first of all, though, before we start getting into some of the articles that I've set aside, among them is going to be that 25 rules of disinformation, which I didn't get to last week. We're also going to be talking about Fran Scher's new article and about conformity in general. Before I do get into that, though, I want to play the following clip. This is for the High-Rise Safety Initiative. As you remember, Ted Walter is the guy behind that. He's been on the show to talk about that. It's trying to launch a new investigation into the destruction of Building 7 and force the New York City government there to investigate the destruction of that building along with any other collapses of high-rise that might happen in the future. So let's listen.
What if your office tower completely collapsed after a fire? Hard to imagine, isn't it? High-rise buildings are built to withstand raging fires without falling. They have been for decades. And yet, in the late afternoon of September 11th, 2001, this building, World Trade Center 7, collapsed to the ground.
And I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. It looked like it had been done by a demolition crew. The whole thing just collapsing down on itself.
It wasn't hit by a plane and had only scattered fires burning. My name is Don Butterfield. I've been a practicing architect and engineer in New York City for close to 50 years. Many of us in the architecture and engineering community are concerned that this building could collapse the way it did. So we are supporting the High-Rise Safety Initiative, a ballot measure that would require the City of New York to investigate the collapse of this building and any future high-rise collapses. If you care that our buildings are safe to live and work in, join me in supporting the High-Rise Safety Initiative. Go to highrisesafetynyc.org to learn more for the safety of all New Yorkers.
So there you go. Very good commercial. Very great effort being put forth by Ted Walter and his crew for the High-Rise Safety Initiative. And what it does is it appeals to the common sense of New Yorkers. All right, you have this building, fell later in the day on 9/11 only because of scattered fires. Fires should not be bringing down a steel frame 47-story high-rise the way that that building came down in 6.5 seconds. It just should not happen, folks. All right, so for the safety of all New Yorkers, it needs to be investigated. So again, it appeals to the common sense of the people watching it, and why wouldn't you investigate it? All right, because the high-rise collapses should be fully investigated to prevent it from happening again. You don't want a fire to break out in your building that you might work in and just cause the building to suddenly fall. All right, because assuming the official story, or pretending the official story was true, playing devil's advocate, I mean, this is a huge safety hazard. We have to prevent it from ever happening again. So I love the approach of the High-Rise Safety Initiative, and I hope that that they're successful in getting this ballot measure passed. That would be a huge boon for the movement and be a step in the right direction for uncovering what really happened that day. Also, too, I just want to mention this really quick. We have an article from David Chandler up at AE911truth.org. It says, "Why I am convinced 9/11 was an inside job." Now, there's an introduction attached to this by Mike Cook, and what it illustrates, or what it points out, is that David Chandler, he's a physics teacher. He's the one who embarrassed NIST at their press conference following their report on the destruction of Building 7. He's the one who got him to admit to the free fall of Building 7 when he asked his question, got them to put it in their revised version of the report later. So he got him. I mean, them acknowledging free fall was huge. Well, he's got this article out. Mike Cook attached this introduction. Essentially, it points out that that AE 9/11 Truth doesn't take a stand on who was involved, simply points out the science that the buildings were brought down into controlled demolition, but it highlights a lot of the same arguments that we've heard over the years from David Chandler, from other members of the 9/11 Truth community, pointing out the science of the building destructions, okay, in the beginning, and then goes into his own views of why he thinks it was an inside job. Inside job can mean a number of varying levels of government complicity. So I want everyone to to read that. It's a very good article, very common sense approach, even to the inside job argument as well. Because when the media does put so much effort into stifling discussion of this topic, when the government refuses to even just test their dust samples for any kind of explosives or incendiaries, to rule it out and make it the investigation complete, then you got to start suspecting some individuals within those organizations of wanting to cover it up. All right, and again, we try not to get into that in this show. We try to stay faithful to the mission of AE 9/11 Truth, but obviously the evidence has major implications, because who would have gotten access to these buildings to plant explosives in them? So great article by David Chandler. Again, that's at ae911truth.org. You can check that one out. Okay. Now, before I move on any further, what we're going to do is what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We're going to do that starting now. And that is 10 seconds. Now, this week's show has a theme about mass psychology, the media, and conformity. And a great article to lead that off with is Fran Scher's newest article, Why Do Good People Become Silent or Worse About 9/11? That's the name of the series. This is part 6. It's called Conformity. And the article starts off, in the early 1950s, experiments by Solomon Asch of Swarthmore College vividly demonstrated our human proclivity to conform to a group's prevailing view. Several students selected prior to the experiment were instructed to act as if they were subjects of the experiment, whereas in reality they were Confederates, or plants. These Confederates were all instructed to give the same wrong answer in identifying the length of a line on a cord. One real and unsuspecting subject was then joined the group, and when the experiment was underway, an instructor assigned the task of matching the length of a line on a card to the correct line among 3 different size lines on the same card or another card. In 36.8% of the cases, the real subject would abandon his or her original right answer and would agree instead to the other participants' unanimous wrong answer. Now, I'm going to play a clip that delves into this experiment by Solomon Asch. I got this off of YouTube. It's an old educational film about the experiment, but it gives you a general idea. You can't see it, obviously. This is an audio broadcast, but in the video, you see the people sitting at the table looking at the cards. They have different lines printed on them of varying lengths, and that they're doing the experiment I just read to you, where they're having to compare them and give correct answers on which ones match. So I'm going to play that clip for you right now.
But an experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are Confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2.
2.
2. 2.
2.
3.
3. 3.
3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2.
2.
2. 2. 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1.
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the third position, who also gives the correct response.
1. 1. 2. 1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with the group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1. 1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
So there you go. That is a clip from YouTube from an old educational film about the experiment. Now, the parts where the subject's voice is echoing and he's saying something to the effect, "Oh, what will they think of me?" I think that was dubbed in later for dramatic effect. They didn't have a probe inside his brain able to hear his thoughts there. But that was footage from the experiment, and that just illustrates what Fran Scher is talking about in this great article about how people will go along with the group. Very simply put, mass peer pressure. Okay, and you see that, of course, in relation to what's gone on with 9/11 over the past 13 years. I see it demonstrated to me when I bring up Building 7 to people and I show them just a video of it falling, if they watch Blueprint for Truth, and people will say, well, you know, it looks like a controlled demolition. I mean, the evidence is there, the science is solid. It's just, I just can't believe it. I just won't believe it. All right, it's that last barrier, that last obstacle standing in their way is, well, one, just that they can't face the idea that that there's more to this crime than what they thought, and the implications of that cognitive dissonance, which Fran Scher has covered in previous essays in this series, but also to the mass peer pressure. All right, the fact that other people around them have not been exposed to this information. It has not become as trendy and cool within their peer group to acknowledge what really happened that day to those buildings. And so they have to provide themselves that loophole, that little escape hatch out of their own perceptions so that they can still be accepted by the group. And you see this on so many varying levels in our society. I used to witness it and make note of it when I was younger. I'd go to the movies, and I would notice that movies always seemed funnier, comedy movies like Adam Sandler movies. When you go and you sit in the theater, when you're in a big group of people and somebody laughs at something that is really just asinine and stupid. I mean, really just something you would not find funny if you're sitting and watching it by yourself, but because you're in the audience with so many people, varying personalities, somebody laughs, everybody laughs. All right, so it becomes more funny. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're just looking at entertainment and it doesn't have any serious ramifications on our society like going to a movie does. All right, but that's just another example. And you go and watch the same movie at home, it's not as funny anymore because you're not in that kind of party atmosphere like you are with a movie theater. You're not within the groupthink of that small room. Okay, so there's just another example. And you also know that people don't like to upset the flow of things either. Notice how many times you hear people politely laugh when somebody makes a really lame joke. I remember this when I was going to college during some kind of tour. You know, you're in high school, you go tour the college, and for some reason I just took a particular note of this when the tour guide made some really lame, stupid joke, and two girls gave this sort of sheep-like laugh, which just went, eh. Now maybe I was being a little mean in making that observation, but it's just another example. People will just go along because they want things to not be awkward. People hate when things are awkward. All right, they don't like when the flow of just general society is disrupted, and it makes sense to a certain extent when you look at it on a survival mindset. You know, people have to rely on society to keep on functioning. They don't want something to threaten the security of their society because that society is protecting them too. All right, the society that still puts the products on the shelves that they buy, grows the food, provides for the general protection of the people. They don't want to think that there's anything wrong with that. And on something as big as September 11th, that's just heightened. And just getting back to Fran Scher's article here, I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from it. Skeptics know well this feeling of isolation that arises from refusing to believe what officials have told us about 9/11, but we can especially feel ostracized if we speak up about the evidence that contradicts the official story. We are in a minority on a very emotional issue, one that elicits fear in most people. A remark by the director of a prominent peace and justice organization illustrates this basic human fear. When I asked her if her organization would co-sponsor a speaking event with our 9/11 Truth organization, instead of answering me, she spontaneously and energetically asked, Fran, have you lost a lot of friends due to your work with 9/11? So it goes to show you right there, stepping away from Fran's article for a minute, that the first thing that this person's mind goes to when she's talking about the evidence, when she's trying to get the organization to look at it and get behind it, at least giving it a platform within their own organization to their members, the first thing that this person's mind is going to is, what is this going to do to me if I get behind it? What will this, how will I look to the group? All right, getting back to the article. In another conversation, as I was telling an acquaintance about my educational work as a skeptic of the official 9/11 story, she immediately lost eye contact with me, drew her body up and back, and announced with a tone of finality and authority, in our family, we believe that 9/11 happened because of incompetence by the government. I was to understand, it appeared, that her family was intelligent enough not to buy the official story in its entirety, but they had chosen to endorse a respectable alternative analysis that kept them solidly within the center of society. It was clear that there was no room for further discussion. And you see people say things like that with finality, like it's the official word. All right, and I've seen that in examples growing up too, where I will say things. Let's say that there was a TV show that I thought was funny, right? And people, jerky people who in authority above me would say something like, well, it's okay. Like they're the final word on that. And I think that happens a lot with people in authority too. This is just kind of taking my own step away from Fran's article, adding my own 2 cents here, is that people who have been flattered by establishments, whether they be a university professor and they've got some high position within that university, they've got a lot of esteem, they don't want to risk their esteem, which relies on the opinions of other people. They also don't want to admit that something got by them in many cases. So when you talk about this, that's where the arrogance kicks in, and they want to marginalize They don't want to look at it. They don't want to keep an open mind. Now, of course, I'm not saying everybody, but in a lot of cases, but obviously there's exceptions to every rule, but in a lot of cases, this is what you see. This is why it's so hard to get this looked at in the academic community, because it is a scary realization, first of all, but for people to strive in a lot of those fields, like in education, it relies on the opinions of other peers, on their peers, who they don't want to upset. Also, too, people in governmental positions, they don't want to admit that something got by them. They don't want to have their authority usurped by somebody who isn't in their position. So a lot of times they will be closed-minded to it as well. I mean, this happened to me. This is an extreme case of it. I'll tell the story really quick. When I was in Uzbekistan, a Peace Corps volunteer, I went down there. There was garbage all over the ground. First thing you notice, like in this town, just ice cream wrappers, bottles, all sorts of stuff, because people didn't have public garbages to throw their stuff out in. So I figured, okay, I would just buy some garbage cans myself, and then have the local kids take the garbage bags and to the dump every week. They wanted to do it because you got to understand, in this country they don't have like after-school basketball or all the television programs and the video games like we do here. Kids are looking for something to do. They want to hang out with the American because I guess that makes me cool down there. Gives me some level of esteem. So this way I could use the labor of the kids, the willing labor of the kids, to get something done in the town. And to my face, the mayor thought it was a great idea. I thought it was wonderful. Behind the scenes, members of his staff went to my friend, my Uzbek friend, and told him Mr. Andy needs to keep his hand out of the garbage. Because what happened was there was a person that was a crony of the mayor that was supposed to be picking up the garbage. He had the taxpayer contract to do it. He wasn't doing it, but by doing this it would make him look bad. All right, so it was an early wake-up call for me, but this happens even in America too. This happens with information. You see this with the media, all right, because they are the reality makers. They are the king daddies of what is real and what is not in their own minds. And they don't like you uppity American citizens speaking amongst each other, reporting your own news, and challenging their official narrative. Because if you're doing that, why are they relevant? Why do we need them? All right, they don't want to have to keep up with us. They want to maintain their position above us. So that is why we're in this situation here. Now, just finishing up Fran Scher's article, in these cases, the human social need to remain in the middle of the bell curve, to adhere to social norms in order to keep one's reputation and respectability intact, trumps evidence, openness, and curiosity, as well as the human need for truth. Of course, there are always exceptions, as the diffusion of innovation studies clearly show. Human societies are, of course, diverse. Some people encourage us to keep our society stable and predictable, while others encourage us to move it forward. If we could find and maintain our human connections, our love and respect for each other, while expressing our divergent views, then we would have a wonderfully stable and dynamic society, one capable of manifesting civilization's highest potential. And this goes back to another point just popped in my head while I'm reading this. You know, I've said it before that the other side, the quote-unquote mainstream media, were the people who made it nasty to begin with. All right, your TV hosts and pundits jumping down somebody's throat for simply asking these questions raised the level of conversation to a higher pitch, added more emotion to it. All right, made it more of an argument than a discussion, which science depends on, folks. People openly discussing their ideas and bouncing them off of each other. But the media did not want to hear it. They didn't want anybody talking about this. So immediately, if you talk about Building 7 looking like a controlled demolition, you were a conspiracy freak. You're anti-American. How dare you? How dare you disrespect the victims like that? So what that does then within yourself, if you're the person saying, well, it kind of looks like a controlled demolition, it makes you more defensive. And the whole level of conversation becomes more emotional. And then the general public steps out of that circle. They don't want to be part of all that negativity. The majority of it. Majority of people just want to live their lives and just, you know, raise their families and and enjoy life. I know this. I mean, I live in the real world. I deal with it every day. And the majority of the public says, you have a point, but they don't want to get involved in all of this negative back and forth, all of this drama associated with this topic. And to a certain extent, I don't blame them, but it was the media that did this. Because even though somebody like a Sean Hannity or a Bill O'Reilly, to most people watching them, they end up looking like huge jerks doing that. It still sets down the precedent that if you get involved with this, you're going to get involved in some high drama. You're going to get angry. Your emotions are going to be touched on by being involved with the debate. And who wants to get involved with that? Who wants to be in a negative situation like that? So I just wanted to throw that in there. Concluding Fran's article, it says, it takes individuals who are psychologically secure to consider divergent views open-mindedly and respectfully. Such secure individuals are also more prone to stick to their own opinions if supported by the evidence, in contrast to those who become caught in a spiral of silence, such as those who jumped on the bandwagon in the last moments of the German elections. And unlike the 36.8% of the ASH subjects who abandoned their correct answers in favor of the wrong answers of the majority, in short, unlike those relatively insecure individuals who feel a greater need to be liked than to be free to have their own opinion. The Milgram, Elliott, Zimbardo, Festinger, and Ash experiments and Elizabeth Knowles Newman's theory of the spiral of silence all show characteristics of groupthink, a subject we shall explore next. So that'll be the next article by Fran Shore. But that's so important to understand why we are in this situation right now, and why, despite the overwhelming evidence that the buildings in New York were brought down in a controlled demolition, people don't even want to explore the possibility. Never mind saying it was a controlled demolition outright. They don't even want to have a new investigation just to rule it out, just to deal with the controversy. People don't even want to talk about it for the reasons that I explained earlier. So we have that article that's up at ae911truth.org. You can read the whole thing for yourself. But, getting back to groupthink and general society, a lot of people stay silent or they buy the official story because they believe that we have a completely independent-minded press. That, you have all of these cable news stations. You have all of these local news shows around the country. So many vigilant reporters out there looking out for the interests of the American people, right? Particularly, especially with local news. Even if the main media is controlled, the big national networks, what about local reporters? They are more likely to speak out for themselves, correct? Well, interestingly enough, I'm going to play a clip for you right now, just to give you an idea of the state of our media. Especially with the local news. This is from Conan O'Brien, and actually, to Conan O'Brien's credit, he's doing a huge service to the American public by playing this. And this is something that a lot of people already know about the local news, but it's funny and it's so startling to see it laid out for you like this. Now, you can watch this on YouTube. Obviously, watching and hearing are slightly different things. You can hear, I'm going to play it for you right now, but there's several clips just like this. And what this is this is different local news reporters around the country all reporting the same story, starting with the same line. And this isn't the only case in which Conan O'Brien has done this. And this is also not just one local news station reporting this same story and starting it with the same opening line. All right, now in this particular video, I'm going to play the stations are blurred out, but there's other videos that do the same thing with different stories that show the logos of these local news stations. And these are local news stations from different or affiliated with different networks, NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox. So it's not just one network handing down news to all their affiliates, which would be bad enough, but these are all different stations, different, with different affiliates reporting the same thing. So I'm going to play that for you right now.
A lot of people these days think the big news stories are either the upcoming presidential election or the upcoming London Olympics. Well, judging by local news, apparently there's an even bigger story that's sweeping the nation right now. Here's a look at today's real top story.
And welcome back to the show. I scream, you scream. You know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. Well, I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
Got it.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all know the rest of it, right? I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, and you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest. Well, I scream, you scream, well, I think you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, and everybody knows the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, and you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I don't find that funny. I find it scary. Yeah. It scares me. All right.
And I don't find it funny either. It scares me as well. So Conan is right on the money there. And again, he's doing a tremendous service by playing that for the general public. But what's going on here? Now, I have an article here from the Tampa Tribune titled "Defending Local TV Anchors Slightly" in Conan O'Brien's side-splitting viral ice cream mashup video. And it says, "No one loves a good joke poking fun at the dismaying state of local TV news more than me. But Conan O'Brien's side-splitting clips showing local TV anchors reading the same copy while introducing video stories feels a little like shooting fish in a new media barrel. A way of poking fun at these journalists for doing something news outlets or on other platforms do all the time. The latest O'Brien mashup takes 26 anchors who all use the same joke to introduce a story about an ice cream-focused smartphone app saying, 'I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.' It's fun to see many different ways the local folks play with setting up the same entire joke. And it's also an automatic indictment of the news outlets which would dare to use such cookie-cutter techniques for filling news hole in their news broadcasts. Except for one thing, other news platforms do it too. No one would think to grab an Associated Press story reprinted the same way in 20 different newspapers and laugh at how it all says the same thing. But that exactly is what these local news outlets are doing, reading an intro provided to them by the CNN News Source Information Network through a technology reporting series called Clicked In. Correspondent Karen Kaifa pulled together a story on a smartphone app which finds nearby ice cream trucks and provides recipes. A text sent along with the story provides the opening line, "Everybody nicked." Hopefully the anchors or producers involved will now take a moment to write original intros for their stories, and if they don't now, they should make it plain that a reporter hired by CNN is doing the stories, not a reporter on their staff. But unless you're going to snicker at every New York Times story slapped inside your local newspaper, you might want to give the TV folks a tiny break on this one. Well, I don't give them a tiny break, and it's not even so much the reporters. I don't even call them journalists. They're more like the customer service of Empire, but the higher ups, the local news broadcasters. You can see this with my local news. I mean, they report on whatever shooting happened in Utica this week. They'll report on the local news. It really doesn't get in the way of the national picture. But when it comes to the national news, then it's usually some clip handed down from NBC News by Brian Handelsman. And NBC News is, of course, part of the good big corporate media monster that we're fighting against now. So they don't even get into the national news, and people can argue that it's not the local news's place to get into the national news. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show that we really don't have as many independent investigative journalist sources in America as people instinctively believe. We believe that with the different packaging and different color of the product being provided to us, that there's some kind of variation. And I say different color, what I mean by this is, have you ever seen an Andy Warhol painting where they'll take one subject, let's say it's, I don't know, historical figure like Marilyn Monroe, and it'll be the exact same picture placed 4 times on the same canvas. So you'll have one picture of Marilyn Monroe in which her face is red and the background is blue. You'll have another picture of her in which her face is green and the background is yellow. Another one where her face is orange and the background is pink, and so on. All right, but it's all the same picture. You're not looking at anything different, just the colors have changed. So in this case, people are getting different mouthpieces. They're getting a new, in one case it's a blonde woman, in another case it's a black man, in another case it's an older silver-haired white guy on the local news. So you think that you're getting it from all these different sources, but they're all reading the same script. And even if they put a slight variation on the script, they're all essentially reporting the same thing. A greater study would be on whether or not these reporters reported anything really different about this ice cream app that they were doing their stories on. Did anybody report anything slightly different in these cases? That would be a great study. Now, I have this article from the New York Times. It says, you can change the channel, but local news is the same. And it says, call a reporter at the CBS television station here, and it might be an anchor for the NBC station who calls back. Or it might be the news director who runs both stations' news operations. The stations here compete for viewers, but they cooperate in gathering the news, maintaining technically separate ownership, but sharing office space, news video, and even the scripts written for their nightly news anchors. That is why viewers see the same segments on car accidents, the same interviews with local politicians, the same high school sports highlights. The same kind of sharing takes place in dozens of other cities, from Burlington, Vermont, where the Fox and ABC stations sometimes share anchors, to Honolulu, where the NBC and CBS stations broadcast the same morning show. The changes have drawn the ire of critics who charge that there are fewer and fewer journalists actually covering local news. The agreements behind this sharing are also attracting the attention of another group of viewers: federal regulators. Amid stiff competition for advertising revenue, these agreements are a survival strategy for weak stations, said Perry Sook, the chairman and chief executive of Nexstar, which owns the CBS station here, KLST. The rise of the agreements resembles the retrenchment of the American newspaper industry, but it has been far less publicized. The Federal Communications Commission does not know how many agreements exist between stations, making it impossible to judge their effects. But Julius Genachowski, the FCC chairman, indicated last week that the commission was beginning to study the issue. It's something we're taking a close look at the FCC, he said. He sounded especially curious about what he called behind-the-scenes cooperation between stations that collaboratively sell ads and negotiate contracts with distributors. Even as the internet use rises, local television remains the #1 source of the news for most Americans. There's an honored history, parodied in the film Anchorman, of competition between stations, just as there used to be between newspapers in some major cities. But the owners of stations have gradually reduced costs and arguably competition. Building on the long-time sharing of cameras and helicopters by stations, the first shared service agreements for newsrooms and local marketing agreements for ad sales were put in place more than a decade ago. They became more commonplace, according to local TV executives, during the recession, when stations suffered mightily and reduced their news staffs, even while adding newscasts to create more opportunities for advertisers. The agreements enabled some stations to carry out further layoffs, and they continue apace, most recently in the Toledo earlier this spring. So this is just laying it out again about how they're all sharing resources, they're sharing stories written, and a lot of it is being handed down to them. I don't know if this article mentions that. And you can blame it on whatever you believe. You want to say that it's the national media consolidating power and dictating to the local news, handing down stories, or it's just a result of the economic situation, the fact that major media outlets have to scrimp and save and and find money where they can, so they consolidate with each other, and again, that's why we see a lot of the same news stories coming out from different stations. Regardless of what you want to blame it on, the result is the same. That's why the news stories go through the same path that you see, and why a common narrative is put out to the general public on events like 9/11. Because nobody wants to stand out. And this goes beyond just societal pressure. There's an economic pressure, too, when somebody speaks out about this, and the media does its contrived outrage act against that person who speaks out. That has major implications for the station that he is on. And, of course, the Americans at home are caught in the middle. And as mentioned in that article, TV news is the main source of news for most Americans. I have this from July of 2018. It's a Gallup.com. It says, preferred news sources varies by age, education, and politics, among other factors. Television is the main place Americans say they turn for news about current events. 55%, leading the internet at 21%. 9% say newspapers or other print publications are their main news source, followed by radio at 6%. And what's interesting, people just generally said television at 55%, and then they listed Fox at 8%. These are the people that actually said some kind of local or some kind of news station. CNN comes in next, and then local TV news below those two. So people are going to Fox or CNN first with those networks' particular spin on things, and then they're going to the local TV news, which is getting all their national stories handed down to them from the big cable stations. So again, all of it's filtered by the time it reaches you. Nothing is as independent as you think it is. Now, we're getting towards the end of the show here. I've only got about 5 or so minutes left. I keep promising I'm going to get to this article on disinformation, but there's so many good points to raise here about conformity and local TV. I'm just going to go over a few points here with the 25 rules of disinformation. I'm actually going to be providing a link to this article here on 911freefall.com so you can read it for yourself. And this list was originally generated from a book. When I said it came from Washington's blog last week, I was wrong. The original source of this list was from 25 Ways to Suppress Truth, The Rules of Disinformation by H. Michael Sweeney. And it says, these 25 rules are everywhere in media, from political debates to television shows to comments on a blog. And the very first one says, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. Regardless of what you know, don't discuss it, especially if you are a public figure, news anchor, etc. If it's not reported, it didn't happen, and you never have to deal with the issues. And a perfect example of this was Donald Rumsfeld when he was on Man Called Mueller's show, and he was asked about Building 7, and his response to it was, I never heard of that. All right, the most important day probably in his entire career, he's never heard of Building 7. And he has, because he's been protested by people in the 9/11 Truth Movement. This has come up. They all know about Building 7. And I'd be interested to hear now if he got questioned again, if he's ever heard of it or what he has to say about it. But you see this with people who are on Washington Journal as well, questioned about it. They've never heard of this, even though they have. John McCain denied having any knowledge of the issue, even though he supposedly wrote the foreword for the Popular Mechanics book attacking people who are skeptics of the 9/11 official story. All right, now whether or not he ghost wrote it, when I say ghost wrote it, that means somebody else wrote it for him. Whether or not somebody else wrote it for him, it's still his name at the top of that preface. Therefore, he has responsibility to own up to it. So to deny any knowledge of the topic is absolute malarkey. And the fact is, he had been in contact with Blair Gadsby, activist we interviewed here on the show about a year ago, who was in dialogue with him. John McCain wrote him a letter trying to basically tell him that he's not going to look into it any further. So just deny it. When you're on national television and you're questioned about it, just deny it. Number 2, become incredulous and indignant. Avoid discussing key issues and instead focus on side issues which can be used to show the topic as being critical of some otherwise sacrosanct group or theme. This is also known as How Dare You Gambit. All right, and Bill Clinton illustrated this when he was confronted in public, and he said, "How dare you? How dare you?" And then all of the lemmings in the audience in front of him start clapping because he's the authority figure. He's the former president up there on the stage, and they're all supporters. They're happy to be in the presence of supposed power, and of course, they're going to lead to that groupthink. But questioning somebody's patriotism is not addressing the facts. Getting incredulous about being asked a question about the physics of the biggest mass murder in U.S. history does not address those physics. And this audience knows that, but the greater public is still kind of in the dark on that. So this is what you have to say when the other side plays that card on you. Name calling and feigning outrage doesn't address the scientific evidence. It doesn't make the scientific evidence go away. So I'm just kind of going through these here. The last one, and this is, I'm just skipping to number 7 because I only got room for one more. Question motives, twist or amplify any fact which could so taken to imply that the opponent operates out of a hidden personal agenda or other bias. This avoids discussing the issues and forces the accuser on the defensive. You saw this with Rachel Maddow saying, "Oh, these conspiracy theorists, and how wonderful these conspiracy theories make the conspiracy theorists feel." Well, yeah, I'll tell you what, folks. I felt a lot better when I believed the official story. I felt better about the world. I felt better about the country that I live in when I thought it was just 19 Arabs with box cutters who were able to defy physics and bring those buildings crashing to the ground by running planes into them. All right, that was a better story. That made me feel better about the situation that I'm in. Knowing the truth doesn't make me feel better about the world. I'm happy to be speaking out, and I do want to know the truth. I don't want to be kept in the dark, and I think it is better for the country that we acknowledge the truth, but it doesn't give me a satisfying feeling knowing that. All right, so again, that's just one example of how that tactic is used. Now, we are out of time on this show, so I do hope to get back to 25 rules of disinformation. I keep putting it off. We touched on it today. But remember, folks, we're going to have a New York City firefighter on the show next week, so tune in. Remember, you can hear this program every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download the show by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.